for coming out. Thank you to Campaign for Liberty for co-sponsoring this. And thank you to Dr. Wenzel for coming out and speaking to us. Dr. Wenzel is a professor of economics at Florida Gulf Coast University and got his PhD in economics from George Mason. And he is going to be talking to us tonight about the foundations of the financial recession. So,
thank you. I'm going to start by thanking all of you for coming out tonight. I know you're students who've got a lot to do. You studied economics, presumably, so you know about trade-offs and cost-benefit analysis and all that. So I will confess that you have to step out or whatnot. Also, thank Students for Liberty, Young Americans for Liberty Leadership Institute, and the organizers of this event. There are really two extremes of events, event planning that I don't like, and this one fell squarely in the golden mean of what I do like, so I thank you for that. There's one extreme where this was the case of the Libertarian Party of Florida approached me in about October to give a talk in May. And I thought, oh, great, I'll think about it. A week later, I get a follow-up email saying, have you thought about the date? Can we lock you in? I thought, okay, if you must, sure, I'll think about this in April, but here's my date. A week later, they wanted me to lock in a topic. And of course, I usually don't think from one semester to the next because I'm incapable of doing that. And then there's the other model of conference planning where I arrive at an airport with a vague knowledge that I have to make my way about 150 miles in that direction, but I'm not really sure where. And it sort of kind of falls into place with spontaneous order. So this was perfect, and I thank Marianne and Alex for that. I'll start with a little bit of a story, I suppose. How many of you have never had an economics class? Okay, good. So we speak a common language. This is good. It's always helpful. And how many of you are new to the ideas of liberty, limited government, constitutionalism, minarchy, anarchy, classical liberalism, etc.? So we've got one new person, and then others are veterans, okay? Veterans of this movement. I'm still, I see a Rothbard t-shirt over there, very nice TSA. I usually think I should wear one of those when I'm getting my free massage from TSA, but then I figured there's no reason to anger them, but then again, what would they know? I have a friend, a month after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when security was being ramped up, who was going to a conference, and she had a copy of the book by Murray Rothbard, The Case Against the Fed. Of course, it's a case against the Federal Reserve, but then as her bags were being searched, she thought, oh great, I'm going to jail, I'm going to disappear, because the security officer is going to see the case against the Fed and think, of course, most TSA agents are not students of monetary theory, so we're okay on that one. So I wanted to I'll weave in a few comments about my own path because they may be of interest to you. Mostly 90% of what I'm going to talk about is going to be thinly veiled Austrian business cycle theory and regulatory theory, and Misesian dynamics of intervention, that is, the dynamics of intervention of Ludwig von Mises, as I try to explain the current financial crisis. But I was a foreign service officer way back in the day. I worked for the US government. I was basically a lukewarm Wilsonian institutionalist. That is, I thought that anything that the US government couldn't do could be done by the United Nations. And I went in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, eager into the US Foreign Service. After training, I went off to Mexico City to be a foreign service officer. I was a vice consul and then later a special assistant to the ambassador. And I was frustrated by what I saw, by the inefficiencies of the bureaucracy. And really the one way of thinking about things, that it was so obvious, this was the way you looked at the world and that was that. And so I started reading first Thomas Sowell, who's an economist out of Stanford University and the Hoover Institution, and he's got a book called The Vision of the Anointed, and the subtitle is very telling. It's Self-Congratulation as a Basis for Public Policy. And I realized that what I was reading about by night matched what I saw during the day. And at the time, the only alternative I knew to being a Democrat or a social democrat was to be a Republican. That's the only alternative I knew. So I decided for a while that I was going to be a conservative, and I was going to explore the ideas of conservatism, and we, with another friend, got a subscription to the Weekly Standard, which was, I think it's still around, I haven't seen it much lately, but it's a Republican, slightly neoconservative publication. And we would pass it to each other in a brown paper bag once a week because we didn't want to be labeled as subversives. But I found that I still had a problem with traditional conservatism in that two things. First of all, conservatives were too willing to defend their guy or their woman in power as opposed to defending the ideals. And I think we see a lot of that today on the flip side, where things like we were just talking about this with over lunch, people who were outraged by Bush's war are now not bothered by the same type of thing, morally speaking, that the Obama administration is doing. simply because it's no longer a Republican doing it. That was my first problem, and it seemed to me that both Republicans and Democrats were doing that. And the second thing that bothered me is that it really seemed to me that conservatives were still willing to use the coercive apparatus of the state to advance their own ends. I tended to agree more with most of those, but I was disturbed by the fact that they were still willing to use the state. Then, I remember in January of 1999 on the upper deck of a cruise ship in the Northern Caribbean, because obviously everybody reads philosophy on cruise ships, I escaped from my family for 2 hours to read two powerful essays by Ayn Rand, which are Man's Rights and the Nature of Government. I recommend those to all of you. I'm not a Randian, I'm not an objectivist, but I'm eternally grateful to Rand for opening my eyes to the ideas of individual rights and individual liberties. And so gradually I realized I'm not a conservative at all. I'm a libertarian. I believe in individual rights. I believe in minimal government to protect individual rights. And if you want to get a little more technical, I consider myself a minarchist. Now I know we have at least 2 Rothbardians in the room. I'm extremely sympathetic to anarchy, but the problem I have as an academic is I can't make the full jump until I've read sufficiently, and perhaps as a strategic problem, I read Nozick before I read Rothbard. Now, Robert Nozick is the author of a book that I think all of you should read, and especially if you consider yourself an anarchist. It's a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where he discusses some of the problems, and he's obviously anarchy sympathetic, but he still sees some underlying difficulties with it. And the problem with Nozick is you can't pin him down, because he's too intellectually honest and too smart, so he's going to argue 3 sides of every issue, just to provoke you into thinking fully. I think if I had read Rothbard before reading Nozick, I would be an anarchist now. I'm anarchy sympathetic, because I wonder really if we look at things like the public choice incentive problem, that is, it's very difficult to align the incentives of the rulers with the needs of those they're supposed to represent. And if we look at the so-called knowledge problem, which I'll talk about, which is that rulers simply do not have the knowledge to make decisions for other people, we very quickly bypass any questions of interventionism and socialism, quickly bypass most classical liberalism, we land in minarchy, but before too long we end up at Lysander Spooner's doorstep. That is, we end up with anarchy theory. And I haven't quite wrestled through those issues, and I'm not bothered saying on the record to an audience that I haven't fully wrestled with the issues, because these are not decisions to be taken lightly. These are things that are examined. So my stand right now is, as a minarchist, that the purpose of government is to protect rights. Police, military, and courts. That's not to say that those 3 functions can't be performed partially by private sectors, but that's my prior. That's where I'm coming from. So if you're curious about the ideas, I recommend to you that you come to events like this, that you talk to as many people as possible, that you read as much as possible voraciously, that you read not just in economics and political science, but also in history, in sociology, and basically try to educate yourself as much as possible. And Leonard Reed, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, also like to point out that one thing that Friends of Liberty have to do, or ought to do, is to live as a shining, positive example. Be the kind of person that people can aspire to be, that people are impressed by, in order to sell your ideas, that you are impressing people not just with your ideas, and really, to riff off a book by the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, libertarianism writ large, whether it's anarchy or minarchy, libertarianism is a humanism. It's not about selfishness, and this is why I disagree with some of the Randian aspects. It's about giving people opportunities. It's about respecting people's rights. It's about lifting poor people out of poverty through markets, which can do a much better job in redistribution. It's about standing up and saying that human rights violations are wrong, that it's wrong to deprive people of their rights. That type of shining positive example, at least try to look at. So I want to talk today about the financial crisis. And I'm going to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I'll take questions. I would suggest, and I invite you to do all of this as my pre-commitment device, because I'm a constitutional economist before anything else. Pre-commitment device is basically the idea of putting the alarm clock on the other side of the room so you have to get up, as opposed to being able to slap it. Regardless of how much you like or dislike my presentation, I invite you all to start clapping with great vim and vigor at 6:45. So at 6:45 in 28 minutes from now, please start clapping with great enthusiasm, even if I'm still talking, and that'll shut me up and we can take the rest on in the Q&A period. A few disclaimers before we start. The first one is don't call your broker after this talk based on what I've told you, because if the crisis has taught us anything,